Understanding sovereign debt defaults. An introduction. A country defaults on its debt when it can't pay what it owes. This can look like a few different things, from refusing to pay anything at all to making new deals that change the terms of the debt. When a country defaults, it can have a big impact on that country and the world's finances. It often leads to higher borrowing costs, less access to international money, and economic instability. These defaults often happen because of a mix of things, like too much debt, budget problems, slow economic growth, and political instability. When a government can't pay its bills anymore, it might have to default on its debt. The results of a country defaulting can be really bad. For the country that defaulted, it can lead to investors losing trust, a recession, and social unrest. The country's money can also lose value, leading to inflation and a lower standard of living. Around the world, a default can cause a domino effect, spreading financial instability to other countries and hurting the global economy. The 2008 financial crisis, partly caused by a government debt crisis in Greece, shows how connected global finances are and how a country defaulting can have huge consequences. Similarities and differences, comparing the US and Greek debt crises. Even though the US and Greek economies are very different sizes, their money problems are kind of similar. Both countries have a lot of debt, more than the value of all the stuff they make in a year. But the US has a big advantage because the dollar is the world's reserve currency. This gives the US more wiggle room to manage its debt because it can borrow money using its own currency, which lowers the risk from changing exchange rates. Greece, on the other hand, uses the euro and doesn't have this control over its money. This really limited Greece's options during its debt crisis and forced it to ask for help from the European Union and the International Monetary Fund. The tough rules that came with these bailouts made Greece's economic problems even worse and led to social unrest. The US isn't about to default on its debt right now, but the growing national debt, caused by ongoing budget deficits and an aging population, is making people worry about the US's long-term finances. The Congressional Budget Office thinks the US debt to GDP ratio will keep going up and could get dangerously high in the next few decades if nothing is done. While it's helpful to compare the US and Greece, it's important to remember they are very different. The US economy is much more diverse and resilient than Greece's, with a deep and active financial market. Plus, the US can borrow money in its own currency, which gives it some protection from the ups and downs of global financial markets that Greece didn't have. The US economic landscape, debt, deficits, and the Federal Reserve. The US economy, the biggest and most complicated in the world, is dealing with a lot of different things, like its huge debt, ongoing budget deficits, and the powerful Federal Reserve. These things are all connected and affect economic growth, interest rates, and the value of the dollar, which has a big impact on financial stability in the US and around the world. At the center of the US economy is the national debt, a giant amount of money, over $31 trillion. This debt, built up over decades, mostly pays for government spending that's more than the money it gets from taxes, which creates budget deficits. While some debt is okay, the US debt compared to its GDP has been going up and is now really high, making people worry about whether it can be paid back in the long run. The Federal Reserve, the central bank of the US, plays a big role in managing this debt and influencing the overall economy. Using its tools, the Fed can change interest rates, buy and sell government bonds, and influence how much money is circulating. By lowering interest rates, the Fed encourages borrowing and spending, which boosts the economy. Raising interest rates can help control inflation, but it can also slow down economic growth. All of this makes things tricky for policymakers. Dealing with the national debt means cutting spending, raising taxes, or both. These actions are often unpopular and can affect economic growth and jobs. The Fed's decisions, aimed at keeping prices stable and maximizing employment, can also affect the value of the dollar and how money moves around the world. Anatomy of a crisis, the Greek debt crisis and its aftermath. The Greek debt crisis, a really bad example of a government debt crisis in the Eurozone, shows how complicated things can get, and what can happen when a country's finances aren't sustainable. Caused by a bunch of things like too much government spending, low tax revenue, and a lack of transparency in the country's finances, the crisis put Greece into a deep recession and shook the Eurozone. The main problem was Greece's growing debt compared to its GDP, which got way too high because of years of overspending and bad budgeting. When the 2008 global financial crisis hit, it showed how weak Greece's economy really was, and people started to wonder if it could pay its debts. Because of the crisis, Greece had to ask for bailouts from the European Union and the International Monetary Fund, but it had to agree to some tough rules in return. These rules, meant to cut government spending and increase revenue, included higher taxes, lower pensions, and public sector job cuts. The social and economic impact of these austerity measures was really bad. Greece went through a long recession. Its GDP shrunk by over 25%, unemployment went above 27%, and poverty increased a lot. The crisis led to widespread social unrest, with protests and strikes all over the country,